The Revenant, First Edition, by Joseph Leo Hickey and Amelia Vandergast. Published by Millennium House. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the imaginations of the poets or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Part 1. Absence. To be so lovely and so lost. To be all answerful with all that knowing trapped inside. To be beautiful and broken. Patrick Rothfuss, The Wise Man's Fear. Mortality. As we processed the passing years, we feigned knowledge of the things we had lost. As we walked on the endless fields of grass, the light dropped into our hearts. We thought we knew the meaning of songs, but we no longer remembered dancing, or energy, or the motion of it. You were destroyed without mercy. Age marched on, and took what we thought we never would have a chance to hold, so close to our hearts that its spirit would burn through us like lava, that the devils that haunted our footsteps would crawl into our dreams, and we would never let anyone know what we were dreaming about. Lust. Our lust grew inside us, and the wind was howling down the street, with a scent that would cover the world, and the voice it had forgotten. And the same voice rose out of the shadows, and spoke. And then she appeared, walking silently through the abyss, warming her hands that had not touched another in a couple of decades. Truth that would draw us together in love. Serenity walked through the empty streets where the echoes of voices long gone return in her voice. She walked past the empty forest, where she dreamed of growing closer to the memories she would never possess again. The world followed her. As she walked, the world followed her as she found herself unwelcomed by a world that had rejected her, a world that she had fallen into, and words had been forgotten, been lost in the uncertain oceans of trepidation. She walked so far, she had almost left the city. She had become bonded with her fears, and they walked beside her. She remembered flashes of light and sharp objects cutting her side open. She remembered the mind is easily open when you let yourself be taken over by the forces of truth that invade the spaces where you always thought you were comfortable. And the oceans tempted her to come and dive into their abyss. She became close friends with those who never met her. She began to live life as if she had never died, and tried to find herself in the empty space between charity and denial, life and desertion, desperation and truth. Her father wept over her body and then gambled what was left of his money, and learned to fire a pistol, and learned to steal to survive. And Serenity waited outside the prison, where her father sat and wept. But he didn't recognize her. He only watched as she asked him 1,000 questions, but was led out of the room before she could ask them all. And then she left the prison, and went to her mother's grave, and laid a flower on the grave, and then the flower wilted, and blew across the city because of the breeze. And then pop stars took the flowers that had wilted, and played music as the flower bounced off their guitars. The wilted flower flew across to another city, where trash littered the streets. This rose ended up in a trash can, and it was incinerated with the rest of the trash, and burned so much that its chemical makeup was destroyed. And when the chemicals were finally gone, these chemicals flew up into space and reached the moon, where the gods of ancient Greece waited patiently for the last believer to reject them. And Serenity walked the path to the homeless shelter, and applied for a job as a trash person to clean up the city that was overflowing with trash. They didn't accept her for the position, so she went and did it for free, and stood outside as people watched, and the whole world followed her as she began to sing a song she had only known before the first time she died. And she was the only one alive who had been dead before. She was the only one in the world that had seen the other side. Then One day, she decided to tell people who she was and that she was really Serenity come back to life. But since no one could document where she came from, they sent her to an asylum, where she waited for a year or so for the time on the wall to expire, and she spilled all her truth about the monster that ended her life, in the memory of the sad lament and kiss of pain, and she thrived in the nights when there was no one moving, at the corner of the ward, and she admired the sunlight in the mornings and fell deeply and madly in love with the sunlight. And then they led her out of the ward and threw her violently onto the street, where the same cycle repeated again and again, the same days she spent alone. She knew she had changed so much, but the world had not changed at all. Recovery. She vanished into the crowd of a million lonely people. She vanished into the chasms where there is no emotion in the hearts of men and women. She walked with you as you labored, and then lay next to you as you went to bed and fell asleep. Absolutely alone. She walked back to her high school and saw that it had been abandoned. No students would ever walk there again. She felt inebriated with toxic feelings that nothing was happening. The innocence lost. The death of feelings that could consume the soul. The waiting and then the falling into the river. The floating through the river, the tragic embrace of poetry. Hope returns. She held a candle and walked with you, leading you out of a nightmare. Memory. She remembered the warmth and the smiles in the summer, as her back was against the concrete wall of the building, her long black hair covering her face. Union. She grew closer to those who she thought she would never understand. When she slipped down through into ambiguity, you dreamed of things that had no fulfillment and no payoff. But you knew you wanted to become successful at achieving those things. Mockery. We do not have time in the world to sit idly by while the scoffers roar. There is always music. You know that our songs which we sing in the darkness drown out the songs you sing in the light of day to stadiums of people. Part 2. Resurgence. What is wanted by religion? Our blindness and intoxication and an eternal song over the waves in which reason has drowned. Friedrich Nietzsche. Daybreak. Thoughts on the prejudices of morality. Resume game. Do you want to know what happens after death? Does the fragility of your mortality quiver at the thought? You're right to tremble. Perhaps it's best that life prepares you for the onslaught. The reprieve which you've so desperately sought is the greatest lie ever told. Tune in, tune out. Think of death as a windowless room with a TV screen as the only source of light. You tune in and watch the ones you love wither and rot in their mortal form as they tear themselves apart over the inconsequential, the banal, and the inane. You get to see the shackles of capitalism, communism, false religion, fascism, extremism in all of its forms, narcissism in all of their chastising glory. The oppression is always so well justified, but if only it ended with justification and didn't transcend into elation. For people to rise, others need to fall. Balances of power perpetually transposed until there is nothing left to lose, and the unlucky get to join me, and all the other hostless souls in a room with a view to our worst nightmares unfolding, being forgotten and replaced. When I got to walk amongst the living, each footstep was taken in a blind direction, frantically hoping that it would lead to validation, a feeling of safety, a feeling that I truly had a place in the world, that I would mean something to someone for a time. People still return to my poetry, finding comfort in my comfortless words, born of nihilism and contempt. But that soon ended. They regarded me as a hero for a time, but it wasn't long until I was only briefly remembered on the day I died and the day I was born, as though nothing of great consequence happened in between. Reanimation. Hollywood lied again. It didn't happen as they usually portray. There was no sharp intake of breath, no instant shock snap back into animation. I felt my heart beat first, slowly pumping, cold blood around my body, sating my organs as they started to pulsate. The rhythm of my mortal coil resumed. Sure, I felt a little hollow, but what's new? Shout out to my killer. In a way, I was grateful that my death wasn't tinged with my own despair. The world never existed for me anyway. Poets, artists, cinematography, it could all distract me. But it was a constant struggle to feed blips of bliss into my mind. Most people wore masks, but in mine I suffocated. It had no opening for a mouth. I had no words left to speak in the end. Every exchange left me feeling shortchanged. In the end, I was in debt, with nothing left to give, to me or anyone around me. In my time in stasis, I realized people can be as much of a plague to others as they are the earth. Land is raped for oil, women raped for dominance, forests are cut down, people are torn apart. It's the survival of the fittest. I always knew I wouldn't last long. I could never picture myself growing old. It wasn't that I didn't believe in happy endings. I just knew my life wouldn't work that way. A banal new world. Through my ethereal keyhole to the world I could only see, what I knew to be real, in living form. I could revisit people and places but never see outside of the closed periphery, which I came to believe was everything. Now I've been given the chance to live again, not defined by what I had done before. I had no obligation to the living, not anymore. I no longer have to fit in, because I don't have a place. There are no tables with spots reserved for me. There's no one I can disappoint by hiding away, and pulling back the veil of the true nature of humanity, by reading 1984, and realizing that the resistance fighters are never going to win their war. The machines will always spit on those who live and die poor. Bubble obliteration. My biggest questions lay outside my own existence. Now I see it for how odiously small it was. The smallest things always mattered when there were eyes to see my idiosyncrasy. Were my clothes in poor taste? Did pity rise up in their throats as they saw me presenting myself into the world awkwardly? Or did I force that own bitter pill down my throat? What did they think of me after my admittance that I never liked Green Day or Blink-182? Did they realize my boredom of every routine within the world had reached the highest pinnacle? Did they talk behind my back about the excessive number of Instagram pics in which I faked a smile despite living in a broken world? Did I want to reconnect with the past when it did so little to make me want to stay? I lay with dampened pillows so many nights. My cheeks started to feel raw, but I could do little to prevent the hate and love which would pour from me. I see no reason to go back there where humiliation and degradation were rife, and the artillery which abstracted me was the deftest touch I had felt in years. Lost in fiction. I could only turn to fiction for answers, but I found myself with even more questions. Could I draw parables between myself and the King of the North? There was no Lord of Light to thank for my resurgence. No great mission lay in front of me, but there was air in my lungs, the New York skyline in my periphery, and the hum of humanity in my ears, and that was enough for me. My first acquaintance. A splintering park bench lay under an apple tree just on the outskirts of town. It looked as good a place as any to acclimatize to my freshly renewed mortality. Sunlight was breaking through the city smog. It gently warmed my skin, reminding me just how beautiful it is to feel alive. The small sensations, wind breezing through your hair, hearing the innocence of bird song, feeling grass beneath your feet. I breathed through gratitude for the first time in my life, feeling my lungs swell with actualization and completeness, unburdened with the demand for anything but this perfect moment. A bottle of wine remained from the previous occupant. I started to remember how it felt to drink and to forget. Many bottles had lain beside me, some sweet, some sour, but never more bitter than what already lingered inside me. Death felt a relief, but now the reprieve I once so desperately sought had been stripped away, and the stage light shined upon me once more. But there are no demands that I don a painted guise, and contort my replies so they meet expectation. I hadn't spoken at all in 25 years. I forgot the force of will it takes to force vibrations out of your throat in perfect sequence. The hum reverberated through me. It took all of my energy not to burst out into song. I still remembered all my favorite lyrics. I carried the words of resonance to the afterlife. It was only then I realized the true value in music. Souls exposed, emotions candidly raw, an invitation to true human experience, a lifeline, a connection that not even death can cut. As I uttered words under my breath, hoping they'd find the right arrangement and wouldn't stumble, I was too distracted to notice the proximity of the children playing soccer on the field just in front of me. I was sure they wouldn't be able to hear me. But I got my first taste of humiliation. The lurching sickness was just as transposing as before. I wished for the ground to swallow me whole, knowing it would only spit me back up again. I stood to leave, only to feel a hand on my shoulder. My skin prickled with the heat. I wanted to kiss the stranger to feel a flood of the same warmth, but I was aware of how out of place I looked, and how out of this world I would be. I was ashen, weary, frantic. He was poised, polished, refined, slicked back blonde hair, perfectly angular, dominant features. There was the sense that for his whole life everything fell into his lap, especially women. But somehow his eyes melted into mine, offering a serendipitous synergy, only for him to ask me the time. I looked at the sky and suggested it to be around midday. I wondered where he needed to be while hoping he would never leave. But the moment was as fleeting as any in this world. Frustration and impatience furrowed across his brow. The clock was ticking. It's always ticking. Down, down, and further down. Never higher. Time never allows you to transcend. After he took a few paces away from me, he turned on his heel, and as though it was an afterthought, asked for my number, as though the distance permitted him bravery and rejection was easier to swallow a stone's throw away. He didn't believe me that I didn't have a phone. I couldn't quite believe it either. For years of my life, I stared into the black mirror, urging it to permit me happiness, allowing me to believe that happiness was only in reach when my phone was. He made his way back towards me, holding a wad of cash and his business card. If you want to be connected to the real world, find a way to call me. I watched his silhouette disappear into the city in the direction of the skyscrapers, trying to place the emotion coursing through me. But it felt alien. Was it by chance that the kindest exchange of my life came from a stranger when there was no expectation? The years I spent yearning for affection suddenly seemed even more bitter. A procrastinating world. I left a world which was desperate for change, turning to the nihilism of Nietzsche and the existentialism of Sartre. For their philosophy, unable to take the stagnation, trying to bring art into fruition to dilute the torment, while worshipping monochrome portraits, I found handfuls of them to bow to, all while knowing that they also knew what Wilde said to be true. It is the ugly and the stupid who have it best in this world. Stupidity was a privilege I was never granted. It was something I actively discarded, unaware of how it had shielded me from the loss of hope which came to define me. Humanity felt like an exposed nerve twitching in malicious rhythm. As for my aesthetic, my face was a painted target. My fashion sense a fetish. I coiled my eyes, dressed in studded leather. It was my uniform, my attempt to warn the world of my intensity. Whether it was love or hate, everything had to be felt viscerally. Life had to feel like I was grasping a lemon, squeezing every drop of pleasure and torture until my muscles knew the same ache which lingered in my heart. Who stopped the clock? I see nothing new. There's a coffee shop on every corner, frequented by suited men with furrowed brows, feeling their half-lives consumed, possessed by materialistic desire. Just as many poor line the streets, if not more. Tattered clothes, begging for change. They get coins thrown at them instead. The gutters still offer a putrid aroma, and garbage bags line the streets. The sounds on the streets are the same. There's a cacophony of frustration. It almost sounds harmonious. I can see the beauty in the chaos now. How bored would we be if the world always went our way? We can't rely on change to be our salvation. The same songs are still played on the radio. REM, the Beatles, Bowie, reminding me that it was like I never felt. I let the melodies resonate, the choruses catch, the rhythm arrest my own pulses, but it may as well have been to birdsong, or sirens on their way to tend a tragedy. The concordance which used to speak to my soul just wasn't the same. I stopped asking for something from the music. Instead, I simply allowed for it to be what it was. I was no longer looking to be saved. My mind is one with the world again. But I was under no illusion that my soul is owned, bargained, butchered. That was the compromise which saw my return. I was merely a pawn in a bigger game. I never saw the dice being rolled, but I had to navigate the snakes and ladders all the same. Dinner for one. My entire existence had been trapped in alienation. Loneliness crept in to check on me every hour. It was my most reliable visitor. It was always on time to ensure that I remembered the crushing weight of my failure. In love. Not just romantic love, to which we're also transfixed. What I really envied was for someone to love me, without wanting to fuck me, without wanting some salacious payoff. I never made an admission. I only felt the shame of my burden on the world. I pleaded night after night to feel complete, only to lay down in a newly-laden defeat, hoping to feel someone who would relish in the task of wiping the tears away from my cheeks before uttering words which granted resolve and affirmed what the quotes said to be true. It's okay not to be okay. But they only ever existed on the screen, and that person never came. I never even knew their name, but I came to love that stranger, like it was my closest confidant. They knew it all. My construction-operated phantasm was malleable to my demands, responsive to my contrition. Is there any chance of finding you now that I have an even bigger secret to lurch over me and blister my memories? Is resurrection a red flag? Love-hate. It took me coming out of the dark to realize that it was never life I hated. How could I find complaint in the array of colors the sky would effervescently shine when the sun set? How could I hate those fractures of serendipity which always let me know greater forces were at work? How could I forget the rush of adrenaline reading Plath, Dylan, and Thomas? No, it was never life that I hated. It was people, and their commodified exchanges, where anything could be currency. Empathy, love, support, acclaim, comfort, everything is for sale. Yet there's no value left in the world. At least there never was for me. I felt the boot prints from those who would walk all over me, leaving the demand to smile and braille on my skin. Because self-pity was a grotesque sin, indulgence was frowned upon, no matter how far down you've been driven into the ground. How far did you go? 25 years later, I knew just where to find her. It feels as though I've only just left her. Time doesn't pass when time doesn't exist. Mortality is a flame which death puts out. I'm unsure of why I sought her out, but I remember the way she always used to see me, as if she was seeing a kaleidoscope of color, She never spoke to me, but I figured it would be easier to make acquaintance with a stranger. I found her as wide-eyed as ever. Maybe that was just her response when she clapped eyes on me and screamed my name. I'd almost forgotten it. She asked for nothing but my embrace. She stroked my limp hair until I felt inclined to fall into her completely. When she pulled away and gazed at the despondence in my eyes, I knew at this point I should cry, but emotions are hard to find when you've had none to feel for 25 years. I've transcended self-pity, gifted with the knowledge that we're all just accidents of consciousness, overcooked chimps with anxiety, overcomplicating the world with new labels and justifications. I almost started to miss the knots of anxiety. The only companion who would ever really know me and show me that it cared by allowing my throat to close around vowels and turn a static world into a carousel. There'd be no telling how long it would take to ride it out. But here I am in her living room, green tea in hand, as I hear her daughter play crass records from her room, looking at the lines she'd collected on her face. Somehow it made me wish that I'd collected some too, but for 25 years my body was untainted, while my soul grew wiser with each passing second. She found out that I was pregnant on the day I died. I saw the family portraits hanging on the wall. No sign of a father, just the two of them, bonded by their joint abandonment. She eventually asked me the questions I hoped I wouldn't have to hear. The hows, the whys, I didn't have an answer for. After the disappointment of my confusion, it was hard to discuss the new developments in town. But my attention peaked at the mention of a new record store, Serenity Records. There's only one person I knew that would preserve my memory, hawking pieces of plastic. A cry for war is a cry for death. Restlessness became a constant twitch, forcing me from place to place. With every new destination, I felt the disappointment through a lack of epiphany that this is exactly where I need to be. I found myself in a bar, whiskey sour in hand, savoring each drop as the bitter nectar warmed me. In the corner, the TV screen screeched with fear, the same fear that's been played on repeat for centuries. The handfuls of people did their best to ignore it. After all, they came here to forget. But who could ever forget the face of the politicians who pulled the strings so tightly? It was almost like having a noose around your neck. News headlines flashed across the screen. Our enemies ready to strike. Emergency summit meeting to discuss the possibility of a nuclear fallout. Get out of the city while you still can. Millions predicted to die this coming Tuesday. The announcements were interrupted by your usual infomercials selling antidepressants, holidays in the sun, fake tan, probiotic yogurts. The normality almost seemed macabre around the threats of death. But how else would we spend our last days? If only the real Viking armies had been televised. Would we see the glamour amongst the gore? Crossed swords and splintered shields seem almost romantic compared to hydrogen bombs, elements of nature weaponized. Just as ore had been turned into bludgeoning axes, perhaps there is no better example of humanity. We create and destroy in equal measure, ensuring that we don't just leave a trace. We leave anguish and blood in our wake. Maybe if more people saw the other side, they'd be less inclined to put others there, and more inclined to make declarations of love, knowing that those 3 words would keep the departed warm. When you don't even get to feel the temperature, everything you take for granted is just another thing you'll miss when the light goes out. Standing in the flames. He said, "I'd like to see your foolishness end with a few sticks and a torch." I didn't walk away this time. I strode amongst them, batting their convert or burn placards from my face as they foamed with falsified virtue, whether beaten and vandalized. "Where is your Pope?" I teased. Knowing what they always feared, their religion is a lie. They chanted, blood pressure elevated, "A new savior is among us." More of the dead walk amongst the living than you realize, and only a few of us walk on the side of light. Horror. Is that what God would say? Flashback. I dug my nails into my skin, hoping to feel anything outside of my mind. With blood drawn and skin subtly lacerated, I felt put together. I felt no reason to be afflicted by the weather, and its desire for me to be happy. As the sun shone with a mocking gaze, the blades of grass became tendrils of torment. Love songs on the radio reminded me how shallow desire can be. But it was a constant reminder that the world didn't have to be so cruel. I tapped my pen to the melody, hoping words would fall from me, but all I felt was the static of isolation coursing through me. How could I be a poet if I never wrapped my soul around another's? I tried painting what reminded me of the unequivocal truth, telling myself that one day someone would want to take my hand and lead it through the rain. There'd be cyclones of passion kicking up lust as it furls its angry teeth around us. Perhaps I'd watched High Fidelity one too many times, dreaming of a weary soul who I had the power to complete, but all I see are the caveats, red flags instead of red roses. Not that I'm the romantic type, but for the most part I have no control in the direction in which my mind flows. No dam could stop it. I feel the emotions swell over the embankments. Then I remembered my romantic expectations can only be sated with metaphysical fashion. And the constructions of love which had warned me night after night were fires never destined to be lit. I held the matches in the most merciless of downpours, hoping, praying for ignition, only to feel my own passion dissolve. End scene. My death came back to me before the rest of my life. I remembered how the impact of each bullet, even though the scars had somehow been erased. The sweat rip of bliss tore through my skull, the skull that I had loved and known. But as the blood poured, I couldn't help but feel I'd like to spend a little more time within it. Listen to my favorite record just one more time. Look at his photograph just one more time. Feel the waves break over my feet just one more time. Experience the rush of adrenaline as I finish a poem just one more time. Have an orgasm just one more time. Drink a beer just one more time. Those things never helped me to hold on before. They were small comforts in a world which my body seemed to react to with visceral contempt. My last breaths were choked and with confusion, but I knew I had to save face in front of the shooter. No one else stuck around to witness my slaughter. There was no inch of remorse on his face. Once the bullets left me perforated. I thought I'd seen anger before, but his face contorted before my eyes in a way which made me believe that demons existed. I figured I would find out pretty soon. That's when my thoughts turned to you, and the words I would choke out. If blood wasn't pouring from between my lips, you left unkissed. If my diary could see me, it would think me a hypocrite. I told it night after night in eloquent prosaic ways. My heart had an arrow through it, in love with the idea of being alive. I couldn't bring myself to resign to the fear in an ugly battle with mortality. Wide-eyed, grotesque panic, flailing as organs fail. Through jagged breaths I savor the intensity of daylight. I drank in for the last time, until my nihilistic bubble popped, and I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this was the end. And this end doesn't have a start. There was no time for unanswered questions, only abstraction from the anxiety. My lips curled in the way I thought my toes would between the bed sheets belonging to the man I loved. Red was always my color. Radical compassion. We push away trauma and embrace the torture it offers. There's a humility in caressing your scars and confronting the proverbial blade, one which many aren't strong enough to swallow. It was my greatest regret through my time in stasis, allowing someone else to be the architect of my mind, chiseling shame and lament into me. I imagined his eyes when he saw me, a sublime cocktail of terror and guilt. Would it please me as much as it pleased him to put fear in my eyes? Will I drink in the agony and intoxicate myself with a great thirst? Arriving at the door of his family home, I knocked. As my fist pounded the wood, my mind flooded with regret. Why am I not holding a blade? Why did I come here unprepared? My fingernails dug into my palm as I listened to fumbling in the hallway. Was he drunk again, just as he was that night? As the bolt was drawn back, those black eyes were the last thing I wanted to see, but they weren't there. Only clouded blue orbs stared past me, way into the yard. But my voice spoiled the surprise. Serenity, is that you? You know I died? And now I can feel that you are alive. There was no apology. But none was needed. After I realized it was me with the power to make the shame and hurt dissipate all along, this wretched creature who I prayed would die could not grant me absolution. In the expanse of the darkness, all I wanted was for this moment to come. For it wasn't the man who shot me dead, whose blood I wanted to taste. It was him. I'd repressed it for so long. Only when the life poured out of me I could truly see whose insidious touch scarred me the greatest. In a time when my innocence hindered me, I was a child, much to his delight. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but here I stand, no weapon in hand. But he never needed one. He just possessed his own body, and that was enough to make me want to leave my own. It had belonged to him from that point on. Now it belongs to no one. I didn't have to take his eyes to leave him blind. That misfortune happened upon him without my intervention. I swallowed the temptation to ask questions of how it happened, but I've already come to understand that the universe's will is never underhand. I walked away knowing that Karma was never the bitch we all said she was. She was loyally compassionate. Clock hands. I found myself outside Grand Central Station, watching swaths of people scurry along under the pretense that they are above the creatures branded as vermin. But perhaps rats have the awareness that they have a tail between their legs. Maybe rats are above the grandiosity. Sewers are no place for mediocrity. Maybe they have no awareness of the construct of time, a clockwork system which commands obedience, sundials, hourglasses, iPhones. They all remind you that time is running out. People live as though the clock hands won't break. The mechanics won't fail. What happens if you're like me and you have to face the consequence of your bin being emptied as you fall to the floor? My torn out diary pages lay there, scribing through my hysteria. My pen lay against the page so hard the paper started to tear. Through the weight of my ink-dripping, blunted sword. Perhaps it's true what they say, it is mightier, but using it as my only means of resolution weakened me. I can never be the girl to instigate confrontation. Instead, I'd shy away, find less reasons to make people want to live. But in the end, I always stood alone, and only my diary knew how the poison of modernity ruined me. I wondered whose eyes gazed upon the words which were all supposed to be left unread. Did they have new compassion once they heard of my death? I think of the flood of crocodile tears shed in my name. The lies made up now I wasn't around to contest them, or did they talk of my self-destruction? How I loved to test my limits, just to feel some semblance of emotion outside of depression. An explanation. I suppose you're wondering how I returned. Truth is that I never left. No one who has ever died truly ever does. You'd think the world would be overly crowded. You'd think that the living wouldn't be able to move for the bones of ghosts. But space is yet another construct. Just as we all followed the demands of time, we became limitable by the concept of space. It kept us rooted, grounded, afraid. We so eagerly ingested the fear. We gorged upon it, while simultaneously finding a way to amplify others' fears. Domestic abuse, systematic governmental oppression, Media sensationalism, Stanley Kubrick. It's likely that no one has ever lived and died without force-feeding fear in exchange for power. A validation of significance in a world defined by inconsequence. We're all so eager to make our marks, but so few of us truly do. Shakespeare, Mozart, Einstein. One day their names will also inevitably fade. People constantly talk about keeping memories alive. But what if memories never truly die? People are always too afraid to believe that the afterlife is beyond their comprehension. A ceased existence, heaven and hell, reincarnation. Everyone is always so sure in what they believe, so assured that there is nothing left to understand. We may be able to get to the moon, but in reality, we're like ants trying to understand an iPhone. The afterlife is closer than you think. The veil between the living and the dead is paper thin. Think of it as the difference between turning a light on and off. There is a serenity in the dark. Every obligation, every need, every greed, every fantasy is stripped away and replaced by static. You'd never ask for anything but white noise from a radio wave no longer in use. That's essentially all we are. Frequencies with appetite. Our bodies aren't what we believe them to be. We can look into mirrors and only see what our eyes project. We can see death as the end of life, or we can see it for what it truly is, a freedom. But you're half right. With the concept of hell, after our bodies fail us, we're powerless to what we see. The corruption, the oppression. The world cannot sustain us anymore. War doesn't just impact the living, but also the dead. We're forced to watch or see nothing at all. How long can you sit in a darkened room before your sanity starts to fray? So why am I here? Call it a martyr's privilege. Penance was granted, and for the first time I'm valuable left alive. Enchanted. Someone once told me that we can reinvent ourselves every day. When we wake up, we choose what kind of person we're going to be. But as incantations of our own truth, we see that there's everything to lose and change. A sea of possibility rarely tempts us away from the shallow pool of familiarity, where we know our feet will always touch the ground and our heads will always be above water. So we adopt our most likable personas and parade them with the hope of gaining personability points, then wonder why we feel so disjointed. Would he welcome me back if I showed them the true face of resurrection? Or will 25 years have erased every trace of affection? Would he protest to me knowing more than he does? He always liked the intellectual superiority, which placed him in the power seat. Questions shot through my mind like poison darts, permitting me to wonder if there was something in the air which bound my lungs, until they were too compressed to function in natural rhythm. Part of me felt a burden, but not after I saw his face. I knew exactly where he'd be. To him, I'm a memory. But to me, he's the only one I followed fondly in my absence. I saw pain privately mourn for me. He always told me he was incapable of feeling emotion. I never believed him. Visceral, stabbing torture tore through him. I could always see it in his eyes. On his darker days, his eyes would follow suit. There was no light to be found in them. Just a dark, inviting depth which made you want to find a way to illuminate them. I knew deep down that our misery was the same. But back then, I was foolish enough to believe that anyone was capable of offering a resolve. In my years without a pulse, in my years of phantasm paralysis, it finally sank in. Abstraction is simply a distraction. Comfort has to come from within. Going on vacation may as well be shooting up heroin. We're all looking for an escape. We're all looking for ways to dilute the rage once the facade has been torn off and the nature of true humanity has been exposed. Still, I wanted to offer my own shoulder to cry on, perhaps for my own pleasure. I had always relished in comforting others for personal gratification. In the end, I gave my life for it. Ultimately, I knew the people who surrounded me as shots were fired had a better chance of happiness. It's been a while since I've heard him cry. He'd pulled himself out of the dark without my hand. Part of me wished that seeing my face would allow the ketchup bottle to burst so I have a reason to hold him, pushing all rationality aside. Part of me resented myself for wanting my life to be validated by tears. I recounted the final poem ever written for him. Debauchery and Dreamscapes. You've already slipped between my thighs 1,000 times in my mind. You fed me the frustration, forced it into me, scratched me until I bled, and constricted each breath until the next felt meaningless. You let me carve my name between the synapses of your intellect. You let them snap, fire, and relay the neural itch, as we both felt the sanctity of my subjugation. You let me use my power as a sacrifice, allowing your sanctity to taste that a little bit sweeter. I've already craved you until I was sure I knew the taste. I've already felt the weight of your heavy hands as they led me to absolution, taking the leeches off my chest, never laying to rest what lingers between us, the phosphorus fire, which will burn until I find an outlet for the adoration which is only open in your arms. I'd repressed the urge to send it to him countless times, knowing the rejection which would follow would leave me feeling more ashamed than ever, that I'd surrendered my heart to someone who always thought they could do better. Shuttered oasis. I'd found myself amongst the most run-down streets in Brooklyn. They used to be a bohemian oasis. Street performers used to stand on every corner, 8-foot angels, mime artists. Buskers with their renditions of Tom Waits, Leonard Cohen, Nick Cave, all of the oral alchemy poured through disheveled guitars and dirt-stained hands. Rapturous laughter used to echo from the coffee shops, frequented by bands of art degree-toting liberals all coming together in the name of expression and progression. You could taste the virtue in the air. But now shutters had slammed down for the final time long ago. On most of the stores, lone figures skulked along the dimly lit streets. Propaganda was plastered on every surface. Burnt-out stores were now hateful message boards, spreading the angst that there was no other outlet for. 2 shops on the expansively gray street remained open, a record store and a liquor store. Everything you could possibly need to numb the torment. I had no desire to ingest the bitterly numbing elixir, or to find my place in the world by possessing a piece of cultured plastic. I just wanted to see him, sitting behind the desk of the record store. He had the window lined up with the classics from Joy Division, Killing Joke, and The Cure. "Got anything by the Pixies?" I asked. He was halfway through detailing his collection of rare singles, limited edition presses imported from the UK, when he truly saw me. "I thought I'd drop by. I haven't seen you in a while." We smoked a few joints in silence. I waited for the twitch in his left eye to calm. It was always his idiosyncrasies that endeared me to him. Little charisma to speak of, but he was a frenzy of complexity, which tore me away from the monotony of what it was to be human. I must have looked a child to him now. He was in his 40s, with a hairline which slightly receded, and a stomach which protruded more than it used to. His eyes seemed duller. They had lost their hunger, lost their fight. Pity dared to swell in my chest. I swallowed it down in the refusal to let time pour sorrow over this moment. I may have been resurrected for 5 days before I got the nerve to speak to him, but it was precisely the moment where he told me that he loved me I truly felt alive. If only he didn't follow up with the words back then when we were kids. I guess Morrissey was wrong. All lights do go out. Across his face was a more pressing concern than my manifestation in his world. His hands trembled, his eyes appeared sore, even though we'd sat for hours without a single tear falling. "I think this is the end, Serenity," he muttered with a whiskey glass pressed to his still to this day delicate lips. It was almost like nothing had changed but the degree of certainty that Armageddon we'd been waiting for was finally on our doorstep. It didn't matter who opened the door. We all had to accept the call from terror. Part 3. Purpose. I sat in the dark and thought, there's no big apocalypse, just an endless procession of little ones. Neil Gaiman. The joy in the nightmare. Tear us from the lie that reality is taintless or unmolested. Let the facades of culture which have glossed over the rot decay too. Set the maggots free to tremulously writhe. Don't tend to your scars, let them ooze, weep, and stain. There's no time left for divinity. We are putridity in infected form. Whether it's the ashen bones of sinners or the flesh of virginal virtue, everything erodes, nothing remains, and so it must be. For the world to have a chance at purity, be gratified for every nightmare, every single screaming, searing, cinematic portrayal of frustrated fear where you're powerless, motionless to the horror, directed by your own mind. Lynchian mise-en-scènes are your salvation from naivety. Your ghosts are redemptive forces urging you to grow. You should have learned to trust them while you were still alive. They never had any reason to fail you, unlike the living. The living never forewarned you about the oncoming paradigmatic shift, only blinded you with fairy tales, making you believe that happy ever afters weren't just fiction in a world of safety. Embrace the dark. Find the visceral meaning. Don't let beauty distract you. Let your complacency shatter. Offer it to brutal hands to tear apart. Subject yourself to the subversions of the truth. Your eyelids being prized from comfort is always going to hurt. Sufferance stifled is a life wasted. Kick through the paralysis. Make love to toxic lust. Embrace the surrealist wisdom. Youth paradox. My body hasn't aged a day, but there's an ache in my bones. A dull anguish which I never experienced in my youth. I winced through it, clutching the knowledge, knowing that being able to feel anything at all was a blessing. I now know that I was anything but jaded before. We all like to carry the pretense that we've transcended the capacity for torment, but every utterance of that declaration has been made in vain. Weariness has an invisible weight, which makes each step heavier. Sorrow has a vice-like grip on your mind which can blind you. But the worst affliction is the exhaustion, an unwillingness to throw yourself amongst the anger which clouds the atmosphere. But still through the smog I kept walking in a direction which made sense. His business card was still in my pocket. I wondered if my path would take me back to him, but it never did. I got on a bus out of New York. Hopped on the first Greyhound bus to Washington using the money he gave me for a phone. Maybe I did it because deep down I knew where I had to go. Or maybe I'd just seen too many films depicting the very same. Beat authors had something to answer for. Kerouac's freedom was always an envy of mine. His sepia-colored adventures, which allowed him to meander through America before we all got distracted, before we all got consumed by hate, which now had so many faces. Disconnected, I looked over the shoulder of the woman sat in front of me on the bus as she frantically scrolled, looking for meaning on her phone, fumbling around for a connection only to find discordant hate. It's funny that social media still goes by the same name, given the contempt which bitter minds congregate around, toying with new ways to attempt to be profound. But what if they don't want their wit to be applauded? What if they just want to be seen? What if they just want a solid foothold on the ladder which we all must climb to find our way in the world? The more worlds you tear apart, the more truths you decimate. The higher you stand, pitchforks and persecution are now digitalized. Pick your virtue. Repeat it until the foam on your lips tastes of it. Project your vitriolic disgust until you're encompassed by self-righteous morality. Pretend your body will putrefy with superiority. After subverting yourself into the delusion, we can ever truly be free of imperfection. Construct yourself as purity personified. Put the lacerations on your back as you pretend you're the chastised. After you've chosen your target, any adversary will suffice. They'll take the fall for your ego's fragility, as though they were the ones to blame. That you seek out all of the hate in the world, that your inadequacy shines through the spite, as though you've lived your life better transfixed by hate. Grasp subjective disgust until your pulse knows to quicken. You'll remember every word you said once your body fails. Which words do you want to accompany you in the dark? The eve of war. The first words I read after my return were scrawled on the walls of my school. Anarchist graffiti in the place where memorial flowers were once laid out for me. The spray paint demanded the reader to eat the rich. It was the first time that it truly dawned on me that their hunger was not only felt in their despair, but also in their hollow stomachs. Nothing in life is free, so they say. But we weren't created cash in hand, it seems. That's been forgotten along the way. Everyone has to pay their dues. Debt is a lottery for each new child born. The school was empty, half boarded up. Parents had started to refuse to send their children there for the last decade. I was not the last to die in those hallways. The classrooms, the courtyard outside, even blood had been spilled in the bathrooms. As girls applied their lip gloss and combed their hair, frustrated boys locked onto their targets. All they wanted was to be between their legs without having to treat them with a shred of respect. How could the world be so cruel to them? How many lives had the locked gates saved? How many more simply died on the streets instead, without ever having to learn trigonometry or biology? I suppose it's no use to any of us now. Our intellect is ultimately a hindrance. It permitted us to see the true odious nature of those born into the privilege of handing out oppression, force-feeding degradation into the mouths that cried for progress. But true actualization teaches us that we cast the villains. There are always going to be those willing to play these roles. No amount of insight could change the world now. Too many buttons had been pushed. The war begun years ago. Our time was always running out. But still, houses were sold, and overtime hours were clocked in. People slammed the soles of their feet onto treadmills and did their admin. Only now had a new war been brought to America in a way the time felt right. We dropped so many bombs, yet known so little of the devastation. We could watch the fireworks on TV, but even then, the macabre horror of war failed to resonate. It didn't matter how intellectual, academic, or empathetic we were. No one could truly know how it feels to watch bodies of your neighbors drop to the floor, to see blood running to the gutters, to catch the smell of death in your nostrils. The rest of the world gave us a warning. The president didn't respond to the threats well. She rolled out the welcome mat for the carnage, which would rain down on all of the ordinary people. She never cared for them anyway. For years, the rich have been able to retreat to bunkers filled with champagne and socialite hookers to fuck while the rest of the world deals with the fallout. Ordinary people have just been side characters in the events which shaped the world, contorting it beyond natural function. News anchors informed us that there was no question if the bombs were coming or not. The question was where they would land. Was it finally time for the nuclear war we've anticipated ever since there were big red buttons to press? They say all good things must come to an end, but what about the bad? What about the constant fear, oppression, and hate? Will that end too, all by the grace of a nuclear explosion? I shouldn't have hoped for it, knowing that death is no reprieve. Just an endless expanse of unsated consciousness that has no motivation, because it has no capacity for action. But on the eve of war, I smiled, perhaps with the same appetite for destruction which Metallica had drummed into me, a tribal drumbeat calling the apocalypse. An existentialist's offer to the world. I used to want to write for you. Make the agony fade. Make perspectives shift so they never have to be clouded by the same ennui as mine. But now I'm not sure. I could bear to feel a pen in the hand or the pressure of the keys as my torment is transcribed for voyeuristic pleasure. There are no words of comfort left anyway. Words invite bombs. They're not too effective at disinviting them. Preachers and pundits may be well-meaning, but the world has come to distrust peace and sanctity, finding assurance in the knowledge that someone or something is suffering for our success. In bloom. I have lost count of the times I've romanticized the vision of mushroom clouds blossoming in the sky, erasing humanity. I imagined the bliss of the searing heat hitting me with the affirmation that sufferance would end not just for me, but for the world itself. We'd become too accustomed to greed to want to fall away from the idea that the American dream, which was no longer on sale, happy families behind white picket fences, seemed an archaic illusion. Now lovers lie alienated in apartments, choked on their sadness. The picket fences are now picket lines. Bitterness lies at the core of what it is to be human. Maybe the apocalypse and the rapture were always supposed to be one and the same. Maybe we'd forgotten how to live freely, so we malleably bent to sold ideals. A nihilist dream. Has anyone in history lived and not asked what happens in death? Has anyone in history lived and got to the finish line without regret? Are we any different from wounded animals trapped in the headlights of mortality, frozen in fear awaiting what we've longed to understand, terrified of the final realization? Of course not. Our obsession with what divides us has driven us away from narratives of what makes us the same. I used to be like you, worse in fact. My alienation devoured me. My frustration splintered any hopes I had of putting my sorrow behind me. It was a trend to be in agony, so I grabbed compasses, stuck the needles in my arm, scribing fashion a nihilist declaration. It didn't matter how deep the wounds went. They were all just scratches on the surface, compared to the torturous carousel which would twirl in my mind every night. If resurrection had taught me one thing, it's to grasp commonality when you can, wrap both thighs around it, make declarations of infatuation and never let go. My olive branch to humanity. Sirens cut through the air. Traffic swelled through the city streets. Voices shrieked in panic. We were in the eye of the man-made storm. This was exactly how I anticipated the end. Mass hysteria feed into a frantic scramble of fear. The radio forewarned that the enemy's artillery was only moments away. But for the first time in my life, I kept true to my name. I walked amongst the chaos, as though I was kicking through fallen autumn leaves. Yet I didn't want to feel alone. I'd spent my entire life putting myself in the line of fire of loneliness, closing the curtains, bolting the door, turning off my phone, and still waiting for someone to come and save me. Who was ever going to catch me if no one saw me fall? If the end was truly coming, I had put myself in the way of the greatest harm, without truly knowing the reason. But if death had taught me anything, it taught me to trust my intuition, and those mixed feelings that churn inside of us and argue with our minds. I picked up the handset of a rusted payphone, looking at all the adverts for company for the night, whilst dialing the number, hoping to have some of my very own. He answered. I choked as I introduced myself as the girl from the park, knowing there was only moments before the connection was cut, and I'd find myself amongst the nauseous smoke and dark. He seemed kinder when I couldn't see his face, his chiseled aesthetic, which made my resurrected heart race. Everyone needs a friend for the end of the world. It just so happened mine was a stranger. As alone as I in a penthouse suite, sipping Bollinger champagne, snorting lines of cocaine, chopped by his American Express Centurion credit card. You look like you could teach me a thing or two, he drawled, through wired lips. What would you like to know? I held comfort in knowing. In what may be his final moments, he had a guide, something I never had, something no one ever has, but I told him what awaits on the other side. Was it all for nothing then? You'll have the rest of your existence to decide. Don't sour your final moments with lament. Make a final memory. Don't numb yourself to reality. I placed down the receiver with a heavy heart, but a slither of relief slipped through my mind, knowing that there could never be any other time where a resurrected bipolar poet could comfort the rich. Yet it's he who gave me a final lesson about the world. I'd come to relish in the warmth of my self-righteous beliefs that anyone who hated me was repugnant, as though I had it all figured out, as though I had learned nothing from coming back to life, that even the worst of us crave life, even a life filled with disasters and torture. Warheads versus crowbars. If the figures were to be believed, 6,000 nuclear warheads shared the ground I walked on. Most have been having nightmares about a nuclear bomb since the Cold War. Was this day always destined to come? Were the lives of citizens always going to be ripped apart this way? No more trips to the grocery store, no more Netflix binges, eating ice cream out of the tub, no more birthdays celebrated, no more moments of elation and fear as you tell someone that you love them for the first time, no more anxiety, no more lust, no more heartbreak, just silence and dust. All due to a pissing contest between two leaders who never knew the meaning of leadership. If only crowbars had been placed in their hands instead. But there's no honor in fighting to the death anymore. If thousands of lives aren't the price paid for victory, it's categorized as violence. Sound of drums. From the moment the first warhead was born, the chance of it being detonated was there. A lingering possibility, another prospect of another apocalyptic disaster to mentally contend with, along with climate change or another new plague. The sands of time slipped until there was justification to detonate again. Hiroshima invited a darkened sky, smoke and fire crackling through the architecture. 140,000 deaths wasn't enough to lay to rest our atomic arsenal. Instead, it grew larger, capable of mutually assured destruction. What use was the planet if humanity cannot reap the profits? But don't think of us as victims. Not with our promise of a counterstrike. Sure, it wasn't every American with their hand on the trigger, but we were all equally as responsible. Every ripple of hate and greed fed into the atmosphere and led us to this point, a post-truth humanity, where only the rich are believed and the poor are parrots to be deceived. It takes one person to stand up and be the change. Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama were right all this time, yet neither sold us an ideal worth investing in. Our mortal lives may just be a blip in the cosmos, and our footprints may fade away in time, but we leave behind echoes of our intent, wisps of consciousness which feed into the atmosphere. It goes beyond the nature versus nurture debate. We're the ones who shape the earth. Think of it as a video game, where most of the time you're in control, but for the most part your programmed path guides you. The one choice which is truly ours is the choice between right and wrong. Doomsday Clock. It's been 2 minutes to midnight for as long as I can remember. Generations have lived and died waiting for the hands to strike 12. Paralyzed by the prospect of the apocalypse, has it always been just a matter of time? Or has our ego tricked us into believing that we'll be the ones to see the end? Life on Earth has breathed for 3.5 billion years. But how many anxious breaths have been drawn in, awaiting the inevitable end? I never did like the prospect of dying alone. I thought of it as leaving a party early, and leaving behind joy, sex, narcotics, music, and euphoria. But now I can see that me and the world are intrinsically combined. We exist in each other, whether I'm dead or alive. With fear evading me, I could see clearly. It was just another false alarm. I turned a smile as I recounted T.S. Eliot's infamous words. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Crowds outside of Washington gathered as the sky turned to a muddy black. Radio waves silent. TV studios abandoned. Social media blocked. Some held signs, some held candles. Some held the ones they loved in their arms. I held the knowledge that this was just another lesson in Project Fear. The ice caps are melting. Terrorists are hoarding bombs. The planet is getting warmer. Forest fires blaze. But no one is masochistic enough to invite a counterstrike. I left them amongst the comfort of their catastrophe. Wading into the widespread panic reminded me of wild animals snared in the teeth of a predator above them in the food chain. Death is no picnic, but neither is living. If I was going to fall for the fear, they would have had to confront me with true horror. The people in charge always have an air around them, which tells you that they know more. But they're just as afraid as us. In their $5,000 suits, driving their Tesla cars and checking their Rolexes. If you're looking for authority, look to nature. Apocalypse versus reality. Reality isn't in the habit of matching expectation. What makes you believe it would be different with the end of the world? Whether you're waiting for catastrophe of that lightning bolt of ardent passion hitting as you fall in love, nothing ever truly works out how we imagined. We should have taken this as a sign that there are greater forces at work than our own minds, but we're too stubborn for that, too blind in the belief that just because we can see the forest and the trees, we have a grasp on reality. A final resurging note. If I came back for anything, I came to tell you to wake up while you're still alive. Love remains when all else fades to dust. Let your faith evolve and forget the notion of the cozy catastrophe where you're swept away from responsibility and expectations. Don't go in search of the Kool-Aid to drink. Life is just a ride with no safety guarantee. Our mortality is a gift which we shouldn't be so keen to return to the sender. We've allowed 1984 to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a welcome dystopia which celebrated our fears. Let the post-apocalyptic fiction gather dust and look to the poets for inspiration. Through their misery and adversity, their passion never faded. They found the words to pull beauty from the most unlikely of crevices. This concludes the first edition of the audiobook of The Revenant. Amelia Vandergast is the author of Whispers in the Gallery, an anthology of smoking pains. And if you're watching this on YouTube, her Twitter will be linked in the description. My name is Joseph Leo Hickey. I live in Virginia. I'm the author of 8 poetry books, including Baptism of Apathy, Unity, Love Poems at the End of Our Lives, Leafy, the last poem, Purity Redeemed, the penultimate poems in harmony. I'm currently 27 years old. I founded Melodium House. My upcoming poetry books are I Know Nothing But Miracles and Baptism of Apathy in 14 volumes. My YouTube channel is All the Stars Are Dead. Joseph@melodiumhouse.com is my email. Thank you for listening.